Hi everyone, Charles speaking. So I understand a number of you guys are still trying to come to this session. So let's start perhaps in a couple of seconds, and then I'll start the introduction. Okay, that's probably all right. So it is my really great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Helena Liu, who is a senior lecturer at UTS Business School in Australia. She's a fantastic scholar and has done really important work on critical leadership, gender, race, and neoliberalism that I personally enjoy immensely. In fact, I'll mention also her book that I really recommend, Redeeming Leadership and Anti-Racist Feminist Intervention. I will mention before I leave the floor to Helena, I will mention a couple of housekeeping points. So Helena will talk roughly around, roughly until 8:30. Then we'll have a Q&A. So please use this Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen to ask questions or to make comments. And then during the Q&A time, which will be between 8:30 and 9, roughly, I'll be able to select questions, and then Helena will be able to answer them. So I hope this is reasonably clear. And now over to you, Helena. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here and deliver this keynote to you all today at the International Studying Leadership Conference. First of all, good morning to so many of you on the other side of the world in the UK and Europe, or if you're closer to where I am, I hope you're having a great evening. I would really love to thank Orion for inviting me to be the keynote at this conference. Big thank you to Charles for chairing this session, and Heidi and Keith for making sure that this keynote runs smoothly, as well as Open University, of course, for hosting this conference. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which I present today, the Wangal clan of the Eora Nation, and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. I start with this acknowledgement so that we can all be grounded in the understanding that we are living within past and present systems of oppression. And that is at the center of why we do the work that we do in order to change the trajectory of the future. I'd like to begin all of my presentations by clearing and establishing a principled space. The concept of principled space comes from an artist and activist, Helena Liu, and I learned this process through a scholar activist collective that I formerly belonged to called BARC. The principled space recognizes that we can't ever really ensure a safe space. So as an alternative to establishing a safe space, we can come together with some agreed and explicit principles. So as my talk today is Leadership for Justice, Solidarity, and Love, I thought it was very appropriate that perhaps I would select these three as the principles of our space today. So justice means that we show up today being true to the kind of scholar and human beings that we wish to be. And this talk absolutely represents the kind of scholar activist I aspire to be, the sort of change that I aspire to do with my work, if any at all. Solidarity is my recognition that perhaps we could show up today being aware of our privileges and making space for marginalized folks among us. So if you're somebody who is used to being spoken over or spoken for, I would like to extend radical permission to you today, not that you need mine, to take up space, to feel free to dominate the conversation, to ask as many questions as you want. And thirdly, I choose love as our third principle. And this is a reminder to be kind to ourselves and each other. To honor that we are a diverse group of people here today, not just at the Keynote live, but who may be listening to this recording later on and who are attending this conference from all across the world over these next few days. And honor each other in our learning journeys and honor each other in our different standpoints and viewpoints. On that particular note, I would like to extend an invitation to each and every one of you to get comfortable. It is very early in the morning for those of you there in the UK, and I completely understand if any of you would maybe prefer to have your cameras off. That is absolutely okay with me. I want you to honor whatever it is that your body needs. So if that means, staying in or getting back into your pajamas, cozying up with a blanket, and having that space to walk away from your computer, stretch, walk, get something to eat, get something to drink, do whatever you need to take radically good care of yourself over our next hour together. And really, always. But yeah, just a reminder that please don't feel like you need to be chained to your computer, staring down the barrel of your camera for this talk, for my sake. So I'd like to acknowledge that we're living in very, very troubling times. And especially in recent years, we've seen global understandings of leadership come to represent being at the apex of really entrenched hierarchies and interlocking systems of oppression. And seeing the people who rise to positions of what we may call leadership very much being legitimated by those systems of oppression and using their power to reinforce those systems of oppression. In fact, during our pandemic times, more than ever, we are seeing these global inequities brought into even sharper focus. And yet alongside that, we see everyday people, grassroots movements on the ground, movements led by some of our students in rising up, challenging and daring to question, if not come together to dismantle those constructions of leadership. And I think of the words of Bayo Akomolafe here. The times are urgent, so let us slow down. And this is the kind of intention that I want to bring into this keynote today in recognition of the violences of leadership that we're reminded of every day, but also to hold on to that hope that all of us here as leadership scholars, as thinkers, writers, artists, and activists, we are here to reimagine leadership, perhaps even redeem leadership towards a more just future. I imagine that many of you here today are my kindred spirits in terms of the philosophical and political orientation that you have to leadership and leadership research. But in recognition that we are also potentially a very diverse group, I just wanted to explicate, where I come from as a critical leadership scholar, just so that we could get on the same page. So in the journal Leadership, Dennis Turish talks about the ways in which mainstream, dominant, especially American leadership research has really come to see the same sterile preoccupations dominate the literature. researchers seem content to ask smaller and smaller questions about fewer and fewer issues of genuine significance, producing statements of the blindingly obvious, the completely irrelevant, or the palpably absurd. So, yes, fighting words. And so I very much share this critique of mainstream leadership practices and in the recognition of sort of social realities of injustice around us, that there is an important and urgent need to think about and practice leadership differently. So my philosophical orientation is a recognition that leadership is socially constructed and embedded in the socio-cultural context of its performance. So I'm less interested in the traits and behaviors of leaders as so popular and hegemonic theories have pursued over the last few decades. But I'm more interested in how meanings of quote unquote leadership come into being. So I don't believe there's some sort of universal truth of leadership to be excavated through, objective Western positivistic science, but rather this idea that what it means to be a leader, what it means to practice leadership is very much socially constructed and politically contested. And so where this ties in with my political orientation is that I'd like to direct my scholarship towards resistance against power structures, particularly those interlocking systems of oppression in our society. And a lot of these ideas that I'll share in my talk today is grounded in my book, Redeeming Leadership, an Anti-Racist Feminist Intervention, which was published with Bristol University Press in 2020. So in understanding how leadership has been carved through these systems of oppression, I explore through my book, first of all, this recognition that early theories of leadership took for granted the association of masculinity with legitimate power. So classical leadership constructs through the 20th century were laden with Anglo-American values such as rationality, utilitarianism, pragmatism, individualism, neoliberalism, masculinity, and whiteness. And these traits were kind of unquestioningly associated with being a good leader. And I also wanted to recognize that this is not purely on an axis of gender, as though gender is the only inequality that exists, but and also an acknowledgement that these ideas are very much tied to imperialism, because Europe was home to the so-called Enlightenment man. So his intellect, rationality, and resolve made him not only the most suitable figure to rule over the supposedly submissive, emotional, and domesticated woman, but his dominion was to extend across the world. And this is really where we see these historical ideas of the white man's burden. And leadership was very much born of this idea that this white colonial masculine figure was the person who was the most legitimate and the most innately suited to govern others. In recent decades, we see the rise in high-profile women leaders. And sometimes through this discourse comes with this idea of kind of very eager to celebrate the end of sexism and the idea that, well, because there are a few high-powered female executives out there in the world, then somehow that it means that, we've solved gender inequality. But very much what we're seeing is a post-feminist era, right, where feminism has been co-opted by neoliberal capitalism and defined as an individualistic entrepreneurial project that can be inculcated by the South, as Gillian Orgard so poignantly described. So in this era, it's not sort of so much about dismantling patriarchy as a system of power as so much kind of swallowing up liberal feminist ideas within this capitalist imaginary. So alongside the historical notions of the great man who was most suited to lead, we're also seeing the emergence of a hegemonic femininity. And this hegemonic femininity is innately white elite class, a feminine ideal that is imagined through patriarchal values of domesticity. And of course, inherent to this is a compulsory heterosexuality as well. So, of course, imperialism haunts this idea of hegemonic femininity, as it does with hegemonic models of masculinity. As we can see in the history of British imperialism, just to name one, English women were upheld as guardians of whiteness because it was believed that British norms and morals would be sustained by British women in the settler colonies. So this idea of leadership is deeply entrenched with white colonial models of governance and control. And what I'm recognizing here is the intersectionality of gender, coloniality, and race. And just because this is my entry point into the analysis of leadership and injustice doesn't mean that these are the only axes of injustice or even the most important axes of injustice. Of course, we recognize that systems of oppression happen across not just gender, coloniality, and race, but also across religion, class, caste, sexuality, neurotypicality, ableism. So my entry point through the lens of gender and race is just simply my starting point, and it doesn't need to be the end point of our field. This is the point in my presentation where, just in case some of you might not be familiar with anti-racist and feminist critiques, if it might be feeling a little bit uncomfortable or a little bit awkward, I want to acknowledge that I think really the space to talk very boldly and frankly about sexism and racism is still a relatively new thing. So yes, I want to really acknowledge that it can be uncomfortable to talk about these things in such frank ways. But the purpose of the critique here is not to shame individuals as the so-called sexists or the so-called racists. And that is also partly to acknowledge Sarah Ahmed's critique that sometimes it can be in our society worse to be accused of being sexist or racist than it is to actually reproduce sexism and reproduce racism. And so there's this kind of cruel irony that sometimes we focus so much on chasing innocence rather than our responsibility and accountability to one another in all of us swimming in the waters of oppression, that all of us internalizing these systems of power. So I want to recognize that to remind myself more so than anything that this is really about being hard on systems and soft on people. It's really not a space where it is particularly useful or valuable to point or blame individuals, because when we are all swimming in these waters of oppression, and so we all play a role in dismantling injustice within ourselves and our society. So really the core, the heart of my work in recent years isn't in so much talking about the injustice or recognizing the injustice. There have been decades of feminist and critical race theorists before me who have traced the contours of leadership and injustice. But really, what I have really found more life-giving in my work and my scholarship in recent years is to focus on that power of resistance, of collective movements, of healing and of hope. And so I take so much strength in the people who have walked this path before me, sometimes before even I was born, to clear the path and make it easier for me to think and imagine leadership otherwise. And this is, for me, my intellectual elders are the feminists, the anti-racists who have dared imagine a world where leadership could be redefined from the margins. So some of the thinkers featured here, such as bell hooks, have long recognized the interlocking systems of oppression that make up what is known as dominator culture. So this is the dominant assumptions in Euro-American cultures where command and control come to be taken for granted as not just the leadership norm, but almost like the human norm. So bell hooks pictured here names these systems as the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. So all of that, she combines these four interlocking systems that she calls dominator culture. And this is also very much at the heart of, some of you might recognize Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, which is sometimes understood as thinking of what individuals have in terms of the mix of their gender, racial, sexual identities, but rather what's really at the heart of Kimberly Crenshaw's work has been this recognition of what she calls structural intersectionality. So the recognition that our culture is made up of systems of power that interrelate to one another and cannot really be understood, let alone dismantled individually in isolation. So the theme of my talk today, leadership for justice, solidarity, and love, I present these three areas as what I like to call the sites of struggle. And I've deliberately kept these a little bit vague, although I will dive deeper into each one. I will give you my interpretation of what each of these have to do with leadership and what each of them have to do with our resistance against dominant modes of oppression. But I keep these vague because I would really invite you to imagine what each of these sites of struggle mean for you. And these or other sites of struggle that you really imagine would be the future of a project in transforming, redeeming, or dismantling leadership as we know it. So the first recognition here is that marginalized people have very much been defined via the dominant culture. So throughout history, they've been denied the right to tell their stories and define themselves on their own terms. But rather, dominant culture has been able to categorize them, to define them, and to create what Patricia Hill Collins would call controlling images, right? In other words, the kind of sexualized, racialized, classed stereotypes that fix marginalized people within an existing hierarchy of humanness and legitimacy. And so then from the marginalized people's experience, we have what W.E.B. Du Bois calls the double consciousness, which he poetically describes as a peculiar sensation, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. So this really speaks to the pain of when we internalize dominator culture's ideas of who we are. So the idea of justice here for me is the power for marginalized people, for historically marginalized people, to redefine themselves on their own terms. And when we are able to reclaim our humanness, we are also able to reclaim our own understandings of what it means to lead, what it means to be a leader. And this, I think, opens up spaces where we can reimagine leadership beyond command and control, as now has been sort of traditionally valorized, but to think about leadership as perhaps exercising power with rather than power over. Leadership as happening in the space in between people. And leadership as something that is fundamentally life-giving and fundamentally collective and shared. I then think about ideas of solidarity. And here I think of the poem by Rosario Morales, who says, I'm saying that the basis of our unity is that in the most important way, we are all in the same boat, all subjected to the violent, pernicious ideas we have learned to hate, that we must all struggle against them and exchange ways and means, hints and how-tos, that only some of us are victims of sexism, that only some of us are victims of racism, of the directed arrows of oppression, but all of us are sexist, racist, all of us. This poem, We Are All in the Same Boat, reminds me that solidarity is not about a denial of our difference. It's not about forced unification, but solidarity is recognizing that we can have bids for connection, bids for relationship with people whose oppression are very, very different from our own. But perhaps we all share in a certain dispossession of power and a recognition that we are all trying to float along, trying to survive, keep our heads above water in those systems of oppression. So finding ways to connect to each other across our differences, in spite of our differences, and not in pretense that those differences don't exist or that they don't matter. And these three sites of struggle feed into each other. And so as I began with justice, I end with love. And I choose this picture of a foggy forest to highlight the fact that love is so incredibly nebulous. It is so difficult to define. And indeed, in patriarchal culture, in cis-normative, heteronormative patriarchal culture, love has been perhaps perverted or at least constructed within a very, very narrow definition of romantic, monogamous love. But I here want to imagine love as something broader, as something more abstract, and perhaps even something more cosmic. And so what gets a little bit closer to my idea or idealization of love is Cornel West's quote, "Justice is what love looks like in public." So we get back to justice after all, these three sides of struggle feeding into one another. So a recognition that in dominator culture, where command and control are the legitimate ways of leading, and so where hatred becomes the grammar of everyday life, love itself is a form of resistance. And that means for us marginalized folks who may have experienced a double consciousness of being defined by dominant culture in dehumanizing ways, love might mean reclaiming love for ourselves and love for our own community, love for the others in the margins along with us. And so love here may look like a kind of resistive joy. It may look like insisting on our own and others' full humanities. So in all of these explorations of justice, solidarity, and love as potentially hopeful foundations for reimagining leadership, I also want to acknowledge that leadership may not necessarily be redeemable. We have so many words in the English language that might describe what traditional quote unquote leaders do, right? And in this case, I'm talking about the sort of people who get taken for granted as leaders, such as senior managers or politicians at the top of a traditional apex. And so administration, coordination, collaboration, communication, supervision, teamwork, community building, decision-making, these are all terms that can capture the day-to-day activities that so-called leaders do without necessarily filling this empty concept, this blank canvas of leadership with fantasies of power. And yet it is a tall order to say, okay, let's all just dismantle leadership right now, because leadership in our culture still holds firm to its sacred status in many ways. There are still business magazine articles that talk about 5 steps to being a great leader. Leadership still seems to be a very popular course across business schools. So it holds on to a certain sacred status in certain particularly English-speaking Western states. And so while it still holds that power, perhaps we need to work within its power. So before it might be dismantled, we might think of the ways in which leadership could be reimagined, perhaps expanded to create a certain spaciousness to allow those who have traditionally been denied the mantle of leadership to redefine leadership on their terms. And I want to end my keynote on a particular note, which is that when I wrote my book 2 years ago or 3 years ago now, I think perhaps I, at the time, imagined that individuals with the moral courage, with the will, with the effort, would be able to resist against leadership and its dominant constructions. But over the last couple of years, I now wonder if this systemic criticality towards leadership, or maybe what Mills might call the sociological imagination, really demands certain conditions in order to survive. So it requires security, abundance, spaciousness, compassion, trust, rest, and freedom. And in these urgent times, in times of scarcity, in times of urgency, in times of brutal perfectionism and dehumanization within neoliberal capitalism, it can often be the kind of environment that is exactly sort of toxic to these forms of radical dreaming, as Jennifer Nash would call it. So when we want to reimagine or redeem leadership, it really requires us having these spacious conditions, these generous and hospitable conditions that allow us to do so. But when we are within these urgent and scarce times, we can often fall back, even with the best of intentions, fall back within the grammar of oppression. So I think of some of the activists that I've worked with in recent years who talk about that in order to dismantle, or before we can think about dismantling, we first have to disarm. We have to let go of the very entrenched systems of individualization, competition, and control that we've often been taught, that often become our default when the situation becomes difficult, when it becomes challenging. So if we can imagine not just our political will and efforts, but also what are the necessary conditions, and these conditions might be outside academia, they might be outside traditional institutions, they might be in the margins, in those liminal spaces where we may be able to cultivate the kind of environment that makes it necessary, that helps enable the forms of resistance that I'm talking about in this keynote. So that's just something to think about. Thank you so much for coming along to this keynote. These are my references. And just as a reminder, the ideas from my brief talk today came largely from my book, Redeeming Leadership, that was published with Bristol University Press. It was re-released in paperback form earlier this year with a special foreword by Professor Stella Nakomo. It is honestly worth reading for Professor Nakomo's foreword. Don't worry about my part, but this latest edition is definitely something very, very special. So I hope you'll be able to order a copy for your library or find one in your local library and take a look. I leave you today with a quote from Audre Lorde, who is, of course, a Black woman, scholar, activist, queer, mother, poet, warrior, in her words. And she reminds me that when I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. She reminds me of the moral courage that's necessary for people in the margins to step up and dare to claim their role as a leader. So her words are what I want to end on today. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. We will now have a little bit of time for Q&A. So if you want to drop your questions in the question and answer tab, Charles, as the chair of our session, will very kindly review your questions, and I will do my best to answer as many as I can in the remaining time that we have. Thank you.
Helena, thank you so much. This was really absolutely excellent. So indeed, please, if you have questions, just post them in the question and answers chat, and I'll mention them. So I don't really see any question at this point. I see a comment from Dr. Okay, so this person is saying courage is vital. An anonymous attendee is asking, who inspires you the most, Helena? Is asking.
My goodness. First of all, and yes, courage is so incredibly vital. And I want to acknowledge that the courage is, not an individual trait, as I'm sure you understand, but courage is something that we can collectively work to expand our capacities, our collective capacities for. So how do we create safety for each of us struggling within the margins through solidaristic community building? And who inspires me the most? I think I have to say my students inspire me the most. At the moment, I've got 2 students who are looking to graduate in the coming months, who are looking to wrap up their PhDs, Helen Taylor, Hombo Guo. The 2 of them have really exemplified for me over the last 3 or 4 years that we've been working and learning together. They've really exemplified for me just the deep courage, as Anne noted, and also the incredible integrity and vision that emerging scholars have. And so they inspire me every day with how they show up and their commitment to their vision, to their purpose. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Helena. So now we have a question from Owain Smolovic-Jones. So I'm going to read it. So hi, Helena, great stuff. Thank you for sharing your thinking. I was really taken in by your description of justice, solidarity, and love as sites of struggle. It suggests struggle with self, struggle with systems and structure, maybe also different types of struggle depending on context, and employing, or for example, an employing organization, a social movement, trade union, and so on. It's a different take on the more usual and mostly positive takes on these issues, but also more realistic. So anyway, I just wondered whether you had something further to say on the framing of struggle, and what can other legislative scholars do to help? So do you want me to repeat perhaps the last bit?
No, that's absolutely fine, Charles. And thank you, Owain, for so poetically, lyrically reframing what I said in a much more articulate way. I really appreciate this. And I think you're absolutely right about this understanding of struggle. Struggle, I love how you describe it here, struggle with self, struggle with systems and structures, and also different types of struggle depending on context, right? And for me, I choose these as sites of struggles deliberately with this understanding that they're not easy, right? They're not tick boxes. They're not things that we say, oh, well, just practice just the solidarity and love. Okay, off you go. There you go. You're practicing leadership. But rather recognizing that all of them require quite deep and consistent unlearning on our parts of what may be the default for all of us, right? For all of us who have been born into systems of oppression, who have learned these default modes, dehumanizing and violent modes of relating to other people. The struggle towards solidarity, justice, and love is that constant practice. And when I call it struggle, I also want to recognize that, yes, it's hard. And yes, we make mistakes. as we're engaging in that struggle. And if we can recognize them as such a struggle, then maybe we can expand our capacity to give ourselves and each other more grace as we figure things out through that struggle.
Great, thank you. We have other questions here, which is great. So there are two questions in particular that I'll try to summarize that would like you to say a few more words on the thing you mentioned on being hard on systems but soft on people. So yes, if you could just elaborate a bit on that, I guess, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question, Carlos. And thank you for being here today. This is a struggle within myself. I think in my experience working in more activist spaces, one thing that I'm working very hard to unlearn is being dogmatic and falling and reproducing very moralistic binaries. And I think especially in progressive spaces that I've had the experience of working in and working with is that sometimes we do fall into extremely punishing notions of perfectionism and this kind of like impatience to labeling people as problematic. And so kind of tied to Owen's question, as well as Owen's observation about the importance of struggle, is this recognition that we are all making mistakes. We are all on the path to learning and unlearning the defaults of dominator culture. And especially in recent years, I've just felt it is so vital. This is, not my own idea. This is something that has circulated within activist circles, I think, for decades now. So much so that I tried to look for the original source and couldn't find where it could have come from. But being hard on systems and soft on people, I think, is this really vital reminder of at least my scholarly activist work and the kind of scholar activist that I want to be, in terms of remembering that what we're critiquing is the systems of oppression. And because we are all swimming in those waters, we're all affected. We are all in some ways inculcated into those ideologies. And so it is not about punishing people. And sometimes I think we punish people because the system itself seems too difficult to punish. It's so difficult, like calling Jeff Bezos into account because he's so far removed from us. We're so powerless compared to him. But it's a lot easier to maybe, to criticize or to shun the friend of yours, who started a business, for example. So I think it's this sort of reminder that if we want to imagine more loving, solidaristic ways of relating to others, that we should start with that softness to others.
Thank you. This sounds really, really interesting indeed. Another question from Ola Edwin Vai. I apologize if my pronunciation is not correct, which is likely, unfortunately. Anyway, I read their question, which I thought was really interesting. Would you mind reflecting on the difference in the base of power in the oppression systems contra the power base of the oppressor? What kind of power is there within love, compassion, and justice? So, if I rephrase it, it might be a way to ask you what is the difference between power and domination or oppression, I guess.
Gosh, Lala, that is such a reflective and generative question. I imagine this is the sort of thing that I'll chew over for many, many days after this conference and sort of 3 days later think, I've got the perfect answer for you. For me, I guess, just like really reflecting on here is, I guess I think of the distinction with power over the domination, as Charles surmised, and the power with that I imagine is within love, compassion, or solidarity and justice. And so that power, I think that is power with, has to come within a collective. As an individual, there's very little that we can do to challenge domination. And it is, always very, very risky, I think, to do that. So I think that power has to come from that community and coalition building that we can do among the margins. And to do that, I believe we have to start with loving ourselves, loving each other, unlearning the internalized oppression that many of us have been inculcated within dominator culture. And from that step, we can start building those solidaristic connections that make coalition building possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll take now the question from Johan Alvehus. Again, sorry for the pronunciation, because I think it follows up well on what you just mentioned. So I'll read some of it. As you have shown in your brilliant book, leadership is inscribed in notions of morality. Would you say that we as leadership scholars are also automatically writing ourselves into a moral space when writing about leadership? Or is it possible to chisel out at ways of describing leadership that open up for analysis with more open relation to moral positioning? And with moral positioning, perhaps I'm wrong here, but I'm hearing some kind of coming back of the individual and with their individual responsibility, I guess. That's a possible interpretation among many others.
Can I admit, Johan, I'm reading your just brilliant, thoughtful question. And I'm finding myself completely lost in the philosophical nuances of your question. I'm really not sure how to answer your question. I think it's the sort of thing I'll need a little bit more time to chew over. So I do apologize. I don't have something articulate and illuminating for you, but thank you so much for that question. It really does. I think I need to think about that a little bit more.
Excellent. Another question from Owain Smolovic-Jones about epistemic whiteness. Could you say a few words about that, perhaps, please?
Oh, Owain, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to signal boost my new article out in Management Learning. Earlier this week, I released a article in Management Learning called How We Learn Whiteness. And it was really kind of reflecting on my education as a management scholar coming up through as an undergraduate through a business school, and how especially, like white male thinkers, and I don't mean like purely from as though these are biological essentialist categories. What I mean are sort of thinkers who embody whiteness, colonial and patriarchal ideologies have really formed the canon of management thinking, our disciplinary thinking. So I've really been reflecting on how our discipline is disciplined into whiteness. In so many ways, really, my article just modestly suggested that we should expand who we consider knowers and not just the objects to be known. So who are the people who have knowledge that perhaps have been dismissed or delegitimized as knowledge? And if I may, I want to link with another question that I could see asked by Magnus Ramage, who talks about systems thinking as a potential tradition that I drew on. And one of systems thinking for me was a great example of an eloquent and powerful theory that in many ways I felt, when at least in my limited reading of systems thinking, very much rephrased what a lot of Indigenous thinkers have told us for centuries. And so epistemic whiteness for me is really about recognizing who has had the power to define knowledge and whose knowledge has traditionally counted. And so if we can broaden and expand the power that we give, that we share with different types of knowers and thinkers, then we can also expand our horizons for different types of knowledge.
Brilliant. This is really, really fascinating. I don't see any new questions, so if I may, I will ask one myself with the chair's privilege. So I would have so many questions because I thought what you mentioned was incredible, but perhaps just one. How would you see democracy in there? And if I try to elaborate a little bit on my question, how would you see democratic processes happening between different groups in society? So dominant hegemonic groups and non-hegemonic groups, and how would you see this happening if you think it is possible?
Oh my goodness, Charles, I suspect you're better positioned to answer that question than I ever could. My kind of half-formed feelings around that is the ways in which we've constructed democracy in ways that are very much like defined within the terms of the dominant group, so that certain voices matter, so that certain voices are considered more legitimate. Even those of us who are marginalized, we are all inculcated within those ideologies that prioritize certain voices as more legitimate. And so the idea of a democracy that recognizes, I think, these systems of oppression is one in which we have to think of some way in which we could level the playing field, or some way that we could name these really, really tricky systems of inequity that have permeated the ways in which we understand knowledge and power and leadership in our society. So I have no idea how we would even begin to do that. Although I recognize that grassroots movements, particularly grassroots movements that are around building radical democracy, building solidarity among people towards a common cause, that they've experimented with different forms of organizing, like, teach-ins, consciousness raising. And I think a lot of these tools that have really been developed at the peripheries of society, a lot of them give a lot of wisdom for the ways in which we could reimagine and redeem democracy. That would be in the whole other book series. But those are just my half-formed ideas. Do you have any ideas and thoughts based on your research and your expertise?
No, I mean a few, but I'm not sure I have the answer. And I think what you said is extremely interesting because. Anyway, perhaps that's a discussion for another day, because you could, in fact, say that democracy can also become an oppressive discourse itself, if it, because of the reasons you mentioned, that if representation is not democratized, but you only have a democratic system, in fact, it might be a way also to marginalize minorities and so on. So that's a challenge. I was going to say, but then we're a bit far away from leadership. But in particular countries like India or South Africa, where they have really thought about that, they thought around ways like around things like a quota system, or where voice would be guaranteed for minority groups, but this is just one idea among many, and it's certainly a problem to think about, and I don't have the solution. But perhaps let me see if I see another question. David Collinson, how would you make sense? So I'm quoting here. How would you make sense of the re-emergence of strongman leaders around the world? Really, really interesting question indeed.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for that, David. It's really almost like this ethos of making leadership great again. There's almost like this nostalgia of seeing these so-called, strong men or so-called great men come back as bastions of power and strength and authority. And it just really goes to show how deeply these ideologies of imperialism, patriarchy, and white supremacy are in our society, that they tie into kind of the most fragile parts of ourselves, the parts of ourselves that long for a sense of security, and long for certainty, and long for all of those things in our future. And it seems like the more uncertain or unstable the world feels, the more we cling to those fantasies of leadership. And there are more than enough, quote unquote, strong men who are happy to step up into those positions of authority in order to fulfill a kind of a human hunger, a human appetite for that type of leadership. And I wonder if then perhaps we go back to the conditions that make leadership resistance possible. We go back to the conditions of how do we cultivate security? How do we cultivate security that's not through looking at stereotypical notions of leadership, of a kind of false certainty, but rather how do we cultivate a kind of security that is, dare I say, democratized, a type of security where we're really redefining what that means at the community grassroots level through our bids of relationship with one another, through the connections that we make within community. If we can build a sense of security, safety, certainty there, or at least expanding our capacities to deal with uncertainty and instability, then maybe our reliance on the strongman leaders will be less acute. And just like what Charles said, I want to pick up on his answer earlier. Yeah, I don't have solutions. And I think us as leadership scholars, sometimes it feels like we ask questions more than we answer them. And yet in the process of asking questions and asking them to each other and thinking about the answers with each other, I think we are inevitably building community. Even with the questions that I haven't been able to answer, like Johan, I'm still reading your question and thinking about it, and likely it will keep me up at night tonight. All of these are just such vital, generative prompts for us all to reimagine what leadership means and what it could look like in our world.
Okay, so as I don't see any additional question, we still have a couple of minutes. I will again use my chair's privilege to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on this very interesting point that you, and on which I strongly agree, about imperialism. So do you see, so for example, when you conceptualize gender, you try to look at, let's say, the different ways it works now and so on. In terms of imperialism, I think we probably all agree that it still has a significant impact. But do you see more continuity, let's say, or some modifications, or how would you see the legacy of imperialism in our societies today and its impact on leadership?
I think in some ways we've developed vocabulary around naming the impact of patriarchy or gender inequity in leadership. And, that's not by accident. That's because of the concerted, collective, systematic efforts of feminist scholars before me. But I feel like imperialism has been something that, aside from a couple of really, really clear voices in our field, like I think Bill Cook, I think Stella Nakomo, we really haven't systematically addressed as a discipline. And so I think in my reading, imperialism haunts leadership like a specter. So there are these deeply entrenched colonial notions of leadership that are so present and yet almost hide in plain view. And so they don't seem to be related to colonialism until, I would read the diaries of early colonialists and go, wow, this sounds like this came out of Harvard Business Review. This is so spot on to our contemporary notions of leadership, and also the way that imperialism has evolved in our society. and colonialism and economic colonialism evolved under capitalism, I definitely think that we're also seeing the way that it's changing. So the ways in which leaders talk about kind of dominating the market, and almost adopting, say, like very cultish language, so that they develop cult-like brands that are in many ways about changing people's beliefs and feelings, not just changing or controlling what it is that they do, but, how they feel about what they do. I definitely see that imperialism becoming more subtle and more covert in the ways that it, weavels its way through leadership.
Thank you so much. This was really fascinating. So this is, I think we need to end now. It's 9. So thank you so much. And I guess this will be the end. So I assume either this session will end or Heidi will make it end, if I'm correct. But thank you so much again to everyone, and in particular to you, Helena.
Oh, the pleasure was all mine. Thank you, everyone, for coming along so early in the morning for so many of you, and sticking around through the questions and answers. It was such a delight and a privilege to share this space with all of you today.